Well, good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Jeff Ewart and I'm the Deputy Director of the Midwestern Governors Association. For those of you who might be new to the MGA, just a little bit of background about us. We're an association that represents governors and states in the Midwest. This year we are chaired by Minnesota Governor Tim Walz. Our work mainly focuses around issues of agriculture, economic development, and energy. But to find out, generally more information about our efforts, please visit our website, midwesterngovernors.org. Turning to today's webinar, it is part of our America's Smart Land Discussion Series. With this series, we are partnering with different organizations in the advocacy community to host webinars on topics of mutual interest. And for today's session, we are very pleased to be partnering with the WIRES Group. And the topic of today's session is the recent FERC advance notice of proposed rulemaking and what it means for the Midwest. So just briefly, if you do have questions for today's panelists, and we hope that you do, we want this to be interactive and discussion based. There are two ways you can ask your questions. Either type it into the question box on the GoTo software so that your question can be read aloud, or click on the raise your hand button. And when we get to the question portion, I can unmute your line and you can ask your question verbally. So let me now take this opportunity to introduce our co-host and moderator for today's panel, Larry Gastiger, who is the Executive Director of WIRES. Larry's career includes nearly 20 years at FERC, as well as time at PSEG before joining WIRES in 2019. We are quite pleased to be co-hosting today's event with Larry and with WIRES, and it's been great working with them to put this webinar together. So without further ado, I'll turn things over to Larry to set the stage for today's discussion and introduce our panelists.
Well, thank you, Jeff. WIRES is really pleased to be here working with the Midwest Governors Association, co-hosting this webinar. And I'm looking forward to moderating this panel with really a terrific group of distinguished panelists who are here to talk about a topic that is right on the cutting edge. And it's going to be at the heart of transmission policy for many months, if not years to come. But before I jump into that, let me give you a little bit of an overview about WIRES and what we're about. WIRES is the trade association that is dedicated to promoting investment in transmission, which is a pretty general and broad topic. Our members include utilities, cooperatives, we have RTO members, we have suppliers and vendors, all of whom work in the transmission area. WIRES has been around for about roughly 16, 17 years. We put out a number of studies related to transmission, and which we view as being helpful and hopefully informative to policymakers, regulators, legislators, anyone who's looking at transmission issues. So now turning to the topic of today's webinar, we're going to be focusing on the advance notice of proposed rulemaking that FERC put out at its January meeting, so just last month. The ANOPR, as we call it, covers a lot of territory on transmission issues, but the principal topics are transmission planning, cost allocation, and interconnection, each one of which is a pretty complicated topic in and of its own right. But FERC has decided to tackle all of these in one fell swoop. So a lot of ground to cover within the scope of the ANOPR, but I think it gives us plenty to talk about today, and I'm hopeful that our panelists can help shed some light on some of their perspectives on the issues. We got a great panel for today's webinar. First, I'd like to introduce Eric Vandenberg, a friend and colleague from my days back at FERC. Eric is the Deputy Director of the Office of Energy Policy and Innovation at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. Previously, he served as an advisor to FERC Chairman Neil Chatterjee. And even before that, he worked in a variety of capacities at the Commission, including working in offices that cover areas involving markets and reliability. Our second panelist is Chairman Dan Scripps of the Michigan Public Service Commission. Chairman Scripps previously served in the Michigan House of Representatives, and he has worked for Advanced Energy Economy, and he worked with the law firm of Latham and Watkins in Washington, D.C., among other roles that he's played within the energy sector for quite a few years. And then our third panelist, who is having a little bit of technical difficulties, but hopefully will be joining us pretty soon, is Nina Plaushin. And Nina is Vice President, Regulatory, Federal Affairs, and Communications for ITC. Nina has over 20 years of service working in government and regulatory affairs at the state and federal level. And I think the three panelists together will provide a really interesting and hopefully informative perspective on the issues. So what I would like to do is turn to each of our panelists initially to give them an opportunity to just give a little bit of a high level perspective of their point of view on the ANOPR. And then once we've gone through that, we'll start in with some questions that I have. But as Jeff indicated, we invite anybody who's watching or attending this webinar to submit questions for our panelists. They're open to any questions that the attendees have. And I think that will actually help provide for a more interesting and informative discussion. So I think, first of all, it probably would be helpful, Eric, if we turn to you and get the the insider's perspective from FERC on the ANOPR. And what do you think we should be thinking about as everyone's preparing their comments and starting to digest this pretty ambitious proposal that FERC has out there? So I'll turn it over to you, Eric.
Thanks, Larry. And first of all, thank you for having me today. Really appreciate it, the opportunity to be part of this discussion. I think you teed it up well. There are some really big things going on right now, and I think ambitious is a really great way to describe it. There is a lot packed into the advance notice of proposed rulemaking, so I'll try and do my best to set the stage a little bit and give a little bit of context and a little bit of perspective for those of you who may not have had a chance to read through the entire document yet or are just beginning to think about what your comments might look like. So just to set the stage, I think it's very well known at this point. It's almost cliche to say we are in the midst of a really tremendous resource transition in the United States. It's been well told, so I won't belabor it too much, but there's obviously a very significant change in the fleet, and all of those resources that are interconnected, all of those resources that are seeking to connect to the grid have to go through what we call the interconnection process. And there are approximately in the entire country about 750 gigawatts of generation in interconnection queues across the country. That is an absolutely huge number. And I think, as many of us are aware, that has created some challenges, but I also think some opportunities to look at the processes we're using today and come up with more efficient, cost-effective ways to integrate those new resources that are coming onto the grid and also to provide more efficient, reliable service for customers. So to set the stage, there are two processes that are really relevant to transmission. One is the transmission planning process, and the other is the interconnection process. The transmission planning process is a very regular process, operates on predictable cycles. It has planning criteria. All of the regions have slightly different planning criteria, but they generally revolve around the same types of things, and that is economic benefits, which is often measured in the form of adjusted production costs. So that's essentially kind of how much money do you save by dispatching generators less. So that's a primary measure of economic efficiency, and then also reliability. There are mandatory reliability standards. Reliability remains the cornerstone, I think, of the transmission planning process. In recent years, there have been other ways that folks have tried to expand, the scope of that planning beyond just reliability and market efficiency. Order 1000 is one that comes to mind, which opened up the opportunity for planning regions to consider public policy benefits. So that was an opportunity that was created by Order 1000, but that has not really come to fruition. So we have that process that looks at those two primary metrics, and at the same time, in a parallel process, we have the interconnection process. And the interconnection process is a reactive process. It looks at who's seeking to gain interconnection to the grid, and it identifies what types of network upgrades are necessary to reliably interconnect that individual generator to the system. And the costs of whatever those upgrades are then, in most of the RTO and ISO regions, largely allocated back to that generator. And so what we've been seeing at the FERC level is while that was intended to create cost discipline for those who were seeking to interconnect the grid, it's created a bit of a logjam in a number of situations, because uncertainty in the interconnection process has resulted in folks receiving larger bills than they potentially anticipated. They see the larger bill than they anticipated, and then they pull out of the process. That creates even more uncertainty, and that creates folks who thought they were going to have a relatively reasonable bill potentially getting saddled with even more costs that they weren't expecting. And so you can end up in this iterative process that's caused by uncertainty and cost shifts. And so a lot of the regions have made really valiant efforts to address those things. MISO in particular is one that comes to mind. They've transitioned to what they call a first ready, first served model, which means if you are ready to go and you have a project that's ready to interconnect, it's shovel ready, you're going to go to the front of the line. And so there have been some really big efforts to try and address that, but still at the end of the day, the interconnection process remains a reactive process. And so now I'm going to try and tie all of these things together with the ANOPR. And so I think one of the big observations from the ANOPR is that there could be a lot of value for customers and folks who are trying to interconnect to the grid by taking a more holistic approach. And the way I put it when I try to explain it to people is, coming up with network upgrades and transmission and system enhancements that aren't necessarily reacting to each new generator as they're in the queue, but they're anticipating it. They're anticipating future generation, and to use a little bit of a hackneyed sports analogy, we're skating to where the puck is going to be rather than continuing to react all of the time. So to me, that's really the big idea in the NOPR. And then I think there's a lot of other things that go along with that. To your point, Larry, there's a lot of other things that go along with that. One that I'll just highlight briefly, because it is another big issue, is cost containment. With more transmission and building more transmission to integrate the grid of future, that's going to result in potentially increased costs to consumers. And one of the Commission's core jobs is making sure that we're protecting consumers. And so I think the Commission's intent by casting a pretty wide net over how can we do the process more efficiently and how can we make sure customers are protected, I think all of those things go hand in hand. So with that, I'll stop talking and look forward to discussion.
Well, great. Thank you very much, Eric. I really appreciate hearing that like threshold FERC perspective on it, putting some of those issues into context. Now what I'd like to do is shift gears a little bit from the federal perspective over to the state perspective, or at least one state perspective on it, but probably generally applicable to a lot of other states' views as well. And with that, I'd like to turn to you, Chairman Scripps, to see if I could get just a little bit of a sense of where you from the state of Michigan's perspective is coming on this ANOPR and some of your thoughts about it, at least initially.
Yeah, thanks, Larry, and great to be here. Appreciate the invitation to participate. I think there's a sense among a number of folks that the word ambition has been used now twice, and I would say that I would applaud the ambition of this ANOPR. I think we're broadly aligned, and I think that the ambition of the ANOPR in front of us reflects the scale of both the challenge and the opportunity, and some of the things that Eric talked about. I think it's one of the most difficult things, and I think we'll get into this today, is sort of how do you balance sort of trying to take on the whole thing and this really comprehensive approach to the many interlocking challenges associated with transmission build out, with being able to have something that's manageable enough that it becomes implementable. And I think that's one of the things where that I'm looking at in terms of it's so broad and there are so many questions for comment that you could, I think our summary of just the questions posed where FERC says we also request comment on, just that is 25 pages. And it's just, that's the starting point of the list of questions that we want to answer. And so how do you either with my Michigan specific hat on, or in participation with OMS or OPSI as a state that's on a transmission scene, or as part of the FERC NARUC task force on transmission, really begin to sort of prioritize the issues without losing sight of the interconnection between planning and pricing and permitting that really sort of go into building a transmission system that we're going to need, as Eric talked about, in order to sort of accommodate this massive resource transition. I think the other piece is really sort of thinking about the role of state public policy. And this gets a lot of attention. Eric mentioned it in terms of the Order 1000. I think this is really, in some ways, the first comprehensive effort around addressing state public policy as part of the transmission planning process that we've seen. But the world looks very different today than it did when Order 1000 was issued. I mean, that was really a world that was being driven by state renewable portfolio standards and often statutorily based, enacted by the legislature, et cetera. Today, clearly, state RPSs continue to play a role. We've seen a broader approach with some state clean energy standards and zero carbon commitments. And then we've seen things that go beyond statute. So my governor, for example, has an announced goal of getting us to net zero carbon emissions by 2050, but that's not in statute. There's a council currently meeting in Michigan to figure out what is the optimal path forward on that. But is that a state public policy? Is a state public policy what shows up in the cases that we decide as public service commissions, public utility commissions, in terms of approving utility integrated resource plans and their resource commitments and objectives? Is it the customer demands that we're seeing showing up all over the system? And just in Michigan, you know, companies like GM and Ford, Dow, Whirlpool, and others that have renewable energy targets, zero carbon targets, you know, is that state public policy? And all of that's just on the clean energy side, because I think the one thing that probably unites states, regardless of where you might fall in the sort of clean energy discussion, is that we all have real public policy goals of maintaining reliability in the face of extreme weather and climate change, and really sort of how to think about these things sort of wherever the cause of the change is as the resource mix continues to evolve. And that obviously raises questions that I think really are at the heart of the ANOPR in terms of how do you quantify those benefits? How do you allocate the costs associated with those benefits? And then how do those three Ps that sort of the holy trinity of transmission, the planning, the pricing, and permitting fit together? And I again, ending where I started, I appreciate the sort of comprehensive approach. I don't think that we can do those things in isolation. But I think the challenge is how do you get something that you can get your arms around that's implementable and also that syncs up with processes that are already underway either at the states or within the RTOs and ISOs around some of these things to make sure that we're not sort of accidentally in some ways pressing pause on processes that are ways down the track to see what FERC does. I think we've got to find a way to blend the ambition of the ANOPR with the processes underway in a way that ultimately moves us forward to our shared goals.
Great, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Jeff, I'm not sure if Nina, it might be on by phone. Nina, are you there? I'm just checking to see if you're available by phone.
I am there, and I'm trying to get the camera to work too. Hold on a second. Yeah, this is my life. Well, here's something to know that utilities are so secure that we can't join anything. Yeah. I'm going to go ahead and give my statement and continue to try to resolve my other issues. Is that okay?
I think that sounds great. I mean, I
want to say everyone else, so I will do that. How does that sound?
Okay. I don't know if you were able to hear. I don't know if you were able to hear the earlier statements, but the you know, as you well know, the ANOPR covers a lot of territory. There's a lot going on in the transmission sector right now, and FERC is keeping everybody busy responding to various rulemakings, various technical conferences, you name it. What, from the industry perspective, is your initial takeaways, your thoughts on this ANOPR, Nina?
Right. Well, I'm here as the designated industry person, which is always a little daunting because ITC isn't like every other utility. We are a transmission only company. We do not own generation and we do not own distribution, so we are not vertically integrated. We do have over 6,000 miles of line in a number of states, including Michigan, where Chairman Scripps is from, Iowa, Minnesota, Illinois, Missouri, Kansas, and Oklahoma. In terms of where we are, I think ITC is representational of the industry in the sense that we need to make some changes so that we can get the infrastructure we needed built. I agree with the comment I heard earlier that, Order 1000 was good, over 10 years ago. It was the right thing at the right time. But the world has again changed under our feet, and we can't keep using the same processes and thinking they're going to yield the same results. So whereas when we had Order 1000, we were just really focused on, well, how can we get these intra-regional projects built? And at that point, renewables were beginning to come online, things were happening, but nothing compared to the scope that we see today. And a lot of that is about the change in price point and about the market, but also about other types of mandates and customer demands. So from a utility point of view, what do we care about in this ANOPR? One, we're very encouraged that the Commission is doing this. Some of the positions that are in the ANOPR are things that ITC has been advocating for a long time. We do believe that from a planning point of view, we need to revamp how we plan. Planning has always been incremental in nature, and it has been a bifurcated process in terms of the interconnection queue and the planning queue. And then in addition, the projects themselves have been very broken up into pieces: reliability, economic, policy projects. So what we need to do is have a more holistic approach where we're taking all of that data, putting it together to come up with these really robust regional plans. We obviously have to do some queue reform. It's kind of a mess. And it's not fair. It's not fair for generators to have to languish on waiting to get connected when other people who are their competitors get connected more easily or at a much lower cost. I would say there are also challenges with cost allocation, which I'm sure people have talked about and we'll talk about more, so I won't get into it here, but we do need to look at how we're assigning costs. The Midwest ISO is a good example where we created a very specific type of cost allocation because we were doing a very big build out. Well, that was, over 10 years ago. We're trying to put into service the last MVP in MISO. And what does that mean? Well, it means that, now we need to start all over again and look anew at like who's really benefiting and who isn't. And we can't just leave in place the old generator pays for most of this because that's inherently unfair, and it's also not representational of the projects that need to be built. And then I guess the last thing I would say is, there are other provisions in here that, maybe we're not as enthusiastic about. We recognize what the Commission is attempting to accomplish in terms of, say, cost discipline or oversight, but we're not sure that they have quite the right solution. So we can talk about that more in the Q&A, Larry. I would say that I'm sure the industry is divided on this. There are folks who are not in regional transmission organizations who, of course, aren't going to be on board with a lot of these provisions because they just don't have the same starting point as the rest of the utilities who are in regional organizations. But I think that there's a lot of utilities who are really looking to make investments in transmission. And as long as they can get processes that will allow the planning process to yield projects, then they will get built. So I'll stop there, Larry.
Well, great. Thanks a lot, Nina. Yeah, a lot of change going on. Clearly, that's a big driver behind what prompted FERC to open this proceeding. But as Eric indicated, this is really a look towards planning for the future. Eric, let me turn back to you for a second because just as a threshold matter, anybody who's worked at FERC or worked with FERC knows that process is a big thing in terms of how FERC gets everything done. Can you talk a little bit, just briefly, about what you anticipate in terms of moving forward with this ANOPR? Obviously, we have timelines set up for comments, but there are other things that I've heard that may be in the works, including things like technical conferences, things of that nature. Can you talk just a little bit about what else might be involved as FERC works its way through this pretty big undertaking?
Sure, Larry, happy to do that. Yes, so we do have, process is an important part of anything we do at FERC. We're very focused on process. So you're right. We do have currently it's a comment deadline that I believe is in October. Don't quote me on that. For the ANOPR comments, or sorry, ANOPR comments, we did receive a request for extension, and the commission has not yet ruled on that. So that is still before the commission. So potentially the comment deadline could get extended. After those comments come in at whatever date that might be, I can tell you that staff is going to work very expeditiously to review all of those comments. Chairman Glick has made it very clear to us that this is one of, if not his absolute most top priority. And so we're going to, at least at the staff level, move forward with this very expeditiously. I don't have a specific timeline I can share, obviously, at this point, because it depends on what type of information we get in the comments, but we're going to move forward with this as expeditiously as possible. In terms of technical conferences, I think that's always a possibility. You know, the chairman can call a meeting of the commission anytime he wants, discuss pretty much anything he wants. So I think if he sees a value in that, I think he could absolutely convene a meeting of his colleagues, or he could ask staff to convene a technical conference. So I don't think we have any plans on that front at this point, but it's certainly something that could potentially happen.
Okay. Well, I wanted to also ask you about another matter. While this proceeding is ongoing, FERC instituted a joint federal state task force, which is designed to look at different energy issues between the states and the commission. Can you talk a little bit about the background behind that effort and how that could possibly intersect with this ANOPR proceeding?
Yeah, absolutely. So for those of you who aren't aware, earlier this summer, the commission issued an order establishing a joint board in conjunction with the states and working with NARUC on that. So it's been a long process, but I think we're all really looking forward to the collaboration with states. States have a really important role in this space, as Chairman Scripps was talking about earlier. And I mean that beyond just the permitting space. I think they're a really important player at the table in addressing a lot of the issues that I think we've been talking about, which is what is the impact of public policy? What does public policy mean? You know, thinking about what is really beneficial to consumers and what is the right process for getting the most effective and efficient transmission built. So this is a joint board that was established to facilitate that conversation between the FERC commissioners and the state commissioners. So under the commission's order, all of the FERC commissioners will be members of the task force, and then there will be 10 state commissioners. There's going to be representation from all of the different NARUC regions among the state commissioners. So earlier in July, I believe we got a list of nominations from NARUC. Those are pending with the FERC commission right now, and the FERC commission will issue a subsequent order establishing the members of the task force and also establishing the date and time and agenda for the first meeting of the task force. The initial order did say that the first meeting is going to be this fall sometime, but still working on a specific date, time, and location. So stay tuned for more on that. But in general, you know, I do think Chairman Glick has emphasized to us on a number of occasions the importance of having the dialogue with the states on a lot of different fronts. And I think this is just another example of that. So I'm looking forward to a really robust dialogue sometime this fall. And I think we're going to take what we learn and we're going to combine that with the, I'm sure, very thoughtful comments we're going to get in response to the ANOPR, and I think it's going to be really helpful as we plot out the next step of this.
Great. Chairman Scripps, let me turn to you on that question and do a little bit of follow-up. I think you have some familiarity with the FERC Joint Federal State Task Force process as it's moving forward. What do you see in terms of how that task force could play into or influence this ANOPR proceeding, and just more generally, what your thoughts are about how that task force might work going forward?
Yeah, I think the initial steps have been really, really positive. So I think this came out of some comments that had been raised in discussions, I know, between NARUC and FERC, and in particular Chairman Glick. And I will say, from a state perspective, you know, some of the just signaling, I think, has been really strong. Both the inclusion of members from across the country. As Eric mentioned, each of the 5 NARUC regions, so from the West Coast to the Southeast to the middle of the country, Northeast New England. That's really positive. We have forum participating at the most recent NARUC event in person. 3 of the 5 FERC commissioners, and then Commissioner Clements as well, participating remotely. And that goes a long way too. And having Chairman Glick talking with our president, Paul Schalander of Idaho, about his vision for what this task force would be, and to really sort of roll out some of those details. And I know it hasn't been announced yet, but I know that Chairman Glick signaled publicly at that point that he's hoping that the first meeting can be held sort of in concert with the NARUC annual conference in November. So really beginning to plan. And I'll say, you know, I don't want to get ahead. I'm hoping that I don't get bounced ultimately in the final order. But the folks that were nominated by NARUC, I think, are really, you know, some of the worker bees among sort of state commissions. And in particular, having folks like Gladys Brown-Dutrell of the Pennsylvania Commission, who also chairs the NARUC Task Force on Emergency Preparedness, Reliability, and Resilience, and that sort of overlap between ensuring reliability sort of as the grid continues to evolve. That's really strong. Jason Stanek from Maryland is, you know, a clear star in our group of commissioners, and a past FERC employee. And so somebody who's been inside the building at 888, I think really helps in sort of grounding this. And Chris Rayford from Idaho, active on PURPA and other places where state FERC interaction has sort of shown up in recent years, I think. And, you know, that's dangerous because I've just mentioned 3 and I'm not mentioning the other 6, but all of them, I think, you know, you've got some real folks who are committed to trying to make sure that the states participate in a constructive way. I guess the only other thing I'll say is I don't think I don't know if it was intentional, but having the ANOPR and the sort of comprehensive suite of issues that are included in the ANOPR sort of pending as we get organized. And, you know, if ultimately the schedule holds, that, you know, it may be that we're at a point in our first meeting with the opportunity to discuss after sort of comments and even reply comments have been filed, but very much, you know, on parallel tracks. And I think that's all to the good. I don't know that that's the only stuff that we'll want to talk about in the course of the task force discussions, but it sure is a comprehensive place to start.
Great, thank you very much. And Nina, I know that industry isn't directly involved in the task force, but before I move off of that topic, I just thought I'd give you a chance if you have any thoughts about how you see that process or any other thoughts about it. Yep. I think you're on mute.
Now I'm unmuted. This has been just I have to go lay down after figuring out how to get on this thing. Okay, so honestly, the task force, first of all, we're thrilled, obviously, with the chairman's leadership and being involved in this. I believe that it's very important that FERC stay in sync with the states. I think that ITC has seen that we get the most progress when we actually have a shared vision. And if FERC gets too ahead of the states, then we're not going to really be able to implement things in the regions, particularly where there are wholesale markets and stakeholder processes. So in that regard, I think it's great that this dialogue is going on, because at the end of the day, the states are the ones who's, you know, have the siting authority. They have a lot of authority over generation. And of course, they also have concerns for their customers. And so, you know, we need them to be part of the solution. And so I think this is a really good idea. I know that these sorts of things don't always work out. I don't want to prejudge. I'm sure at this time it is going to work out. But I would say that I do think that we've seen so much push in the states to begin doing things on public policy in particular. When you look at New York, when you look at other states who've really been pushing specific projects or specific environmental controls or even electric vehicle initiatives. So we know that they understand what the drivers are for the need for transmission. So now we just have to come to some sort of collective vision on, okay, so what do we build to meet that need? And then how are we going to allocate these costs? With the last one probably being the hardest, but I have faith that we'll be able to get to the end of that process. So I guess I would say that the states are always involved. We don't need a special board to have them involved, but it does help facilitate the conversation and I think formalize it in a way that should be productive.
Larry, I think you're it's your turn to be on mute.
That's my problem to deal with the technology. I said I'm going to get off of the joint task force item and start actually talking about the item that we're here to talk about, which is the ANOPR. And Nina, I'm going to stay with you for a second. As Eric was talking about early on, one of the main drivers on this is kind of trying to change the focus more towards planning for the future with how we do transmission. I think clearly one of the underlying goals or objectives with respect to what the commission is looking at is how do we get more long distance transmission built to help integrate more renewables into the grid. What do you think from the sort of the transmission developer perspective? What are some of the biggest obstacles to accomplishing those objectives? And what changes do you think would be most effective that FERC should be thinking about that would actually make this happen and get it done? Simple question.
All right, am I muted? Am I unmuted? Is it good?
We can hear you and see.
Excellent. Okay. Here's what I would say. Obviously, there's a number of obstacles, right? And we could focus on all of them, but I'm going to try to do them in order of what's first. The first thing is, at least in places, I would say this is true all over the country, not just in the organized markets, but particularly in the organized markets, that you can't build anything until it's in your official plan. And we can't get things into the plan unless we have the right drivers, we have the right horizon that we're looking at, and then we also have a recognition of the benefits that the transmission can provide. And so the ANOPR looks at all of these things and it says, are we really planning the right way? You know, we've always built just-in-time transmission. Someone needs transmission service, okay, we'll build an increment to serve your need. We don't have, other than say the CREZ process or the WINZO process in Michigan as an example, we don't have forward-looking planning. Yes, we look forward by like 10 years, 15 years, but that's because that's how long it takes to build, not because we're all forward-looking. And so I think that the first problem we have to get our arms around is, okay, well, what do we all agree on what we're building for? And, you know, we kind of punted that in Order 1000. Let's be honest. We created this category called policy projects and said, well, if you want to build one and you want to pay for it, we won't stop you, which isn't really the same as saying we have a planning process that embraces that and recognizes how to get them built. Larry's looking befuddled. He thinks I'm wrong. But I think that, you know, what we need to do now is recognize that so many states have mandatory requirements, if not laws, on renewables. And the market is so advantageous for renewables that people want to use them anyway. And even large customers, you know, these the Amazons and all the other folks who are out there saying we want 100% renewable energy for our processes are all forcing our hand. We can't sit around anymore saying, well, we aren't sure, are we really going to use renewables? I mean, we know we are, right? And we know it's going to be a large amount. And the reality of the grid is, if you're going to introduce a lot of intermittent power, you need to do it on a large scale, geographically speaking, because then you can do better balancing. It's not the only solution you need for balancing, but it's part of the answer. So when you look at all that, you say the first obstacle is planning. The second obstacle is, okay, if we're going to plan all this stuff, who's going to pay for it? And of course, the problem we're having is that people view wind energy as, well, if I'm not actually using that wind energy, then I'm not benefiting. And we've had this problem before to some extent, but it seems much worse now. And a big part of that is because the renewables are all located in certain areas, at least the wind is, where it's really good wind capacity. And so now the question is, well, does that mean that Iowa just pays for everybody's transmission who needs wind because, you know, it's going to be exported, sometimes outside of the region? And so we need to be looking at new and more flexible tools for how we allocate costs. And it can't be participant funding. It can't just be, well, you know, you're going to have to pay more for transmission because then, you know, you can move your power wherever you want. I don't think that solution works, and it's very advantageous for incumbents and very anti-competitive for non-incumbents because there's a pass-through to the rate base for some of them and not for others. And then finally, I guess everyone would bring up siting. Siting is an issue. I will say that ITC's experience with siting has not been a bad one. Generally, we get stuff approved that we propose. I do know that there are projects, and not a number of projects, that have had trouble siting, and it's particularly when you're crossing a state line, because the requirements and the different things that the states look at aren't the same. which is why we need an interregional process, not because it's going to take away siting from the states. We can talk about that in a minute, but because maybe you establish some sort of agreement about what the benefit is for both regions, so that by the time you get to the siting process, there's already some sort of dialogue there and people have an understanding of that, as opposed to this is only good for California because they're going to use the power, so we're not going to allow a line from Arizona. Or, you know, we're not going to have a power line that connects these other two states because you benefit a little bit more than I do. I also think this also goes to the other point I should have made when we were talking about planning, which is the benefits of transmission, which is part of the ANOPR. You know, we really look at the bare minimum benefits that transmission offers today. It's, you know, the least amount you can give it credit for, that's what it gets. Okay, we don't go through and say, okay, well, there's this reliability benefit and there's this economic benefit and there's this policy objective and maybe there's some other, you know, reliability, security redundancy for storm issues. We don't do that. We did that in the MVPs in MISO and we did it a little bit in highway, byway, and SPP. But we have in many areas, you know, these sort of individual projects that fit into individual buckets. And so if you classify as a reliability project, you can't look at your economic benefit and vice versa. And we've got to move away from that. It's very antiquated. It was an artificial categorization that we made because we had to figure out a way to allocate costs and decide what absolutely had to be built and what we could maybe wait on. But I think now that it's just become a hindrance. There's still going to be local reliability projects we have to build, and there's still going to be reliability projects. But I think we need to move away from the idea that an economic project doesn't offer any reliability benefit. It does. If it's part of the AC network, you're going to get some reliability, and we should be trying to measure that and include it. Sorry if that was long-winded.
No, actually, that was great because it kind of leads into a number of other questions. And Chairman Scripps, I saw you had one of your advisors circling around in the background in case you want to have him come in and help. But I thought I'd turn to you a little bit. Well, on this question that Nina talked about and is raised in the ANOPR about how do you define benefits? And I think the commission is probing, looking at a broadening of that definition. And of course, if you're going to broaden definitions, that means costs are probably going to get broadened and spread out as well. I know that raises some of its own sense of concern. I'm curious as to what your thoughts are on how should benefits be defined? What should the commission be thinking about as they're looking at that particular issue? And then let me add on to that, just to complicate it a little bit more, because Nina started getting into it too. Many have pointed to MISO's MVP process as something that was viewed as successful in terms of trying to get a large number of projects built in a fairly collaborative process. I guess I'm looking, Nina touched on some of this, but are there lessons you think that can be learned from that process? And Nina, if you want to chime in afterwards too on it, to talk a little bit more. But is the MVP process something that the commission should be really digging into more and provide some lessons for us that it should be taken into consideration? But let me go back to you, Chairman Scripps, and let you discuss some of those topics.
I will guarantee this will be more interesting if I have my 7-year-old answer, but he has unfortunately left the playroom where my office is, and so I'll do my best. You know, I think Nina's right. We have, in a lot of ways, including in some of the MISO tariffs, the MEP versus baseline reliability, for example, that we look at it from either economic benefits or from reliability, and we don't sort of consider the broader benefits. And I think particularly when you're talking about the kind of, I think, backbone transmission linkages that are at the heart of what my sense is FERC wants to see out of this, and I think that is a broadly shared goal, not universally, but broadly shared, that really means that you need to have a better understanding of the full benefit stack. But I also think it means that you need to have a different understanding of reliability. We're not talking here just about near-term NERC violations. We're talking about making sure the grid as a whole is able to maintain its reliability in the face of changing conditions and extreme weather. And that, I think, is really important. And we don't have to look too far, either geographically or into the past, to see the dangers of getting that wrong with some of the events that we experienced in Texas and other parts of the South earlier this year, some of the issues in California. And that, I think, is particularly pressing when you stop and think about what is to come. these challenges are only going to get more robust. And Eric, it really warmed my Michigan heart to hear you using that old hockey analogy of skating to where the puck is going. One of the favorite expressions, I should note, of Secretary Granholm, used it all the time when she was governor here in Michigan. But that, I think, is really important, particularly as you think about electrification and the increased reliance that we're going to place on the electrical grid in the future in adapting to a lot of this. So I think, as you're thinking about the benefits, I think we just need to get much clearer that even the concepts that seem familiar, the way that we've been talking about them may not be adequate for what we're looking at here. And I think that's one of the most important pieces. In terms of MVP, at the end of the day, it got a lot of projects built. I don't think anybody loves MVP, but if there's a takeaway, I think it represents sort of a way of moving this forward. And that is less about an engineering or an economics sort of, it's how you apply that all in practice in a way that gets projects built at scale. And I think that's the real benefit. If there's a downside to MVP, and I'll take the one that seems closest at mind, is in order to get the sort of buy-in across a footprint for an MVP approach, you really have to show that everybody gets something. And that's in part, I think, to satisfy the FERC criteria that, benefit or cost must be roughly commensurate with benefits. But it's also just the political reality of getting people to sign off on a willingness to have their ratepayers incur these costs. And that means sometimes you have to look at whole tranches. You can't do just a project at a time. MVP, it was all at once. And I think we need something that allows for iterative project development and the ability to evaluate projects sort of on their own, even big projects, but without necessarily having to freight everything up with making sure that everybody gets a piece of it, because I think that can slow down instead of speed up a process that really needs to be accelerated.
Great, Nina. Nina, you wanna chime in on that at all, or?
Unmuted. Okay, can you hear me? Okay, good. I guess I would say this, what made the MVP process work was a recognition that we're never going to get to the point where everyone down to the nickel gets the same amount of benefit from every piece of transmission we built, but that the system as a whole and the benefits we derive from the system as a whole are worth the slight differences. And so having a great market that has a lower clearing price benefits everybody. It's not just whoever built that piece of transmission that got that generation into it. And the same thing with liability. And I do think the extreme weather is a very important point that the chairman made, because part of climate change is not just that we need to build more renewables, it's that it's getting hotter and that we're having extreme weather. And that means the system needs to be different. Now, we talked about that after Storm Sandy, and we talked about it after Katrina, and we have a lot of conversations, and we have made improvements. Don't get me wrong. I think a lot of utilities have stepped up and done a lot. But one of the most important improvements we're going to need is a little bit of capacity in the system and a little redundancy, because at the end of the day, that's how you move power around when things go out. And so, yeah, we're going to build the best towers we can build. Maybe there are new conductors that you can use in higher temperatures. There's a lot of things we can do structurally, but at the end of the day, we need to be able to move power from between regions, and we need to be able to address extreme weather. And so I do think that that's an important piece of this. And some people call it resiliency, but I'm hesitant to do that, because then everyone jumps on me and says, nobody knows what that means. But I think we know what it means. It means not just planning for a certain number of contingency outages. It means planning ahead for what we know is inevitable. We know there's going to be hurricanes in Florida. That's why they've built tower strength that will meet a Category 4 hurricane. We know we're going to have ice in Iowa. So if you know things are going to happen, then you need to think about how you manage that. So I do think that that's important. But I also think, just speaking of it from an MVP point of view, I do agree that trying to say we're going to build 20 projects and here's how we're going to do it in the next 20 years is probably a lot to bite off. And so my guess is that doing it in tranches or phasing it in is probably a good idea. But I would also say that we need to take a look at where the resources are and where we need to move them to, which is a little bit what the ANOPR talks about. Should we have sort of like zones? What should we do about that? And then make decisions about how many projects we need or don't need. we don't want to just arbitrarily limit it. I mean, we need to figure out. And the other problem we have, of course, is, while demand in the utility sector has been going down, we do expect that to increase because we're going to have electric vehicles. We have all these data centers. We have a lot of stuff that's being placed in places where we don't have robust system because there's not a lot of people. And same thing with remote energy sources like wind and solar. And so I do think that we are going to need to think ahead about how do we forecast for what we really need? We can't, do we just say, well, load is down and it's been down for a number of years, so we should just assume that's how it's going to be? Or do we really be proactive and say, well, wait a minute, we know that the infrastructure bill is going to put in 250 high-speed chargers, and we know that this is what's going to happen with electric vehicles. So let's start thinking about that. That doesn't mean we're even going to get new projects. I don't know. We'd have to model it, but at least we need to think about it.
Thanks, Nina. Eric, let me turn to you for a second on this. Nina raised the idea of resilience as part of what needs to be taken into consideration. Do you think, is that something the commission, I don't remember them talking much about this or at all, maybe in the ANOPR, I don't recall. Is that something in terms of the planning for the future that you think the commission wants to have taken into consideration as it's looking at the planning processes?
Great question, Larry. I think you're correct. I don't recall that coming up very much in the ANOPR, at least, if at all. But where it did come up very squarely is in the conference we had on extreme weather earlier this June 1st and 2nd. We heard a lot from a number of different panelists about the importance of transmission in addressing extreme weather. And I think my big takeaway from that conference was improving our transmission planning processes is a good idea no matter what, but it's an even better idea when you start to think about the impacts of extreme weather. And I think going back to what the chairman and Nina have been saying, I agree with much of what's been said. I think from my perspective, Nina said it well. I don't think having a goal of a process where everybody gets the same amount of benefits down to the nickel is really realistic. I think, as the chairman was saying, having a slightly more, the word that came to mind is almost agile, which is not usually something you use when you're talking about transmission planning, but I think a tranched approach or a phased approach, I think could be really valuable. And I think one of the things that could make that more palatable is when you start thinking about the option value that these transmission facilities provide in the context of extreme events. So I don't know that we're ever going to get to a place where we're planning in a deterministic way for all of these extreme events, because there's just too many different permutations of extreme events. But I think time and time again, we've seen the option value that these transmission facilities provide under extreme conditions. So, I think even if you're doing a tranche of facilities, I think it's also possible to think about the benefits that those provide in a new way, because I think a lot of transmission facilities do provide benefits to a much broader set of beneficiaries when you start to think about extreme conditions.
Great. I love the idea of being able to start using words like agile and nimble in connection with transmission. I think that would be fantastic if that's one outcome from this ANOPR process, Eric. Let me just shift a little bit to a different topic that isn't in the heading in terms of transmission planning or cost allocation or interconnection, but is woven throughout the ANOPR pretty considerably, and that is there's a pretty strong emphasis throughout the ANOPR on cost containment and oversight. I'm curious if you can, Eric, if you can shed a little bit more light as to what might be driving the Commission's concern or its thinking on those topics. Are there anything other than sort of more generalized concerns about costs, or are there specific examples or items where cost containment or anything like that on transmission has been an issue? I guess we're trying to figure out a little bit more, those of us who have been reading it, as to what is the driver on that issue?
Sure, Larry, thanks for the question. I think in general, we've talked about it a couple of times today, we're going to need a lot more transmission in this country moving forward. I think there's no debate about that. And along with that transmission, necessarily comes increased cost. Now, I think what the ANOPR is shooting for is, and I think what we shoot for generally at FERC is making sure that costs and benefits are aligned. So we do want to make sure that there are benefits accruing to those who are paying for transmission, but consumer protection is really at the core of what we do with the commission. And so I think the idea of expanded transmission planning and planning for more transmission, and the idea of enhanced oversight, I think those just go hand in hand. So, again, this is an ANOPR. The commission's asking questions at this point. There's no particular findings of fact or determinations that have been made at this point. So I think the commission is just looking to get feedback on some of these ideas. And then I think we'll take that feedback and proceed from there.
Okay, thanks. Nina, let me turn to you a little bit on this issue about cost containment. Obviously, if there's more transmission being built, as Eric says, the cost, the amount's going to go up in terms of the amount investment in transmission. But what do you see as some of the drivers that impact the ultimate costs on transmission projects, particularly things where the initial something else. What do you think the transmission owners have to offer in response to some of these concerns that are indicated there about cost containment?
I have a lot to say, and it would take too long. But here's what I'll start with. We've had having a conversation about transmission costs going back to Pat Wood's chairmanship. Okay, that's how long we've been talking about this. So it's not new. And I think that we've always tried to put this discussion, the industry has always tried to put this discussion into context of, when you really look at large building construction projects, let's start from the beginning, which is everybody has a contingency because it's very difficult to forecast with absolute certainty how much anything is going to cost. And in fact, I just saw a study that was done about which power plants have the most overruns versus which don't. And, you see nuclear having a lot, you then see thermal, and then you see it dropping down, with wind probably being one of the lowest. Well, wind is modular in its building, and a lot of it is done off-site, so it's very controllable, so it's not a surprise. So I start with the context of nobody's ever going to develop a process where there's no cost overruns. I will say there are projects that also go below and under what the estimates were, which we don't pay a lot of attention to. It's like, oh, that's great. And then we all go about our business and complain about the one that's over. And so I think we need to understand there's stuff on both sides of that line. I would say this, there are certain escalators associated with building transmission that occur whether you're the incumbent or a non-incumbent, experienced or not experienced. It has nothing to do with it. And, among those, I'm sure we all know, but I have to look at my notes while holding the screen. So it's, when we look at things like what the cost of buying the right of way is, we aren't going to know that till we actually go buy it, right? Do we have to condemn? Do we not have to condemn? What's the market price? We can do a proxy, but it's not going to be perfect. We have things like our legal costs. We have different types of routing changes we have to accommodate. There's weather, which will impact what kinds of things we have to do to mitigate environmental impacts. There's final engineering design. There's just so many things that we don't know until very late in the process. Even in the middle of the process, we have things that we don't know. Commodity prices, steel prices change dramatically because of tariffs. Well, steel makes up a lot of transformers, and it also makes up a lot of the poles. So, these are the sorts of things, and it's easy to sort of dismiss that and say, well, and the argument I hear all the time is, well, the more you spend, the more you make. We haven't decoupled your industry, and so we have to be really careful because you have this big incentive to spend more than what you actually estimated. And I would say, first of all, I think we need to be very careful about when we talk about the word estimate, because when I put in an estimate for planning, that is not an estimate. That is not the same thing as what I would put in as a bid, say, under Order 1000. They're two totally different things. They're taking one, I've spent all kinds of money. I spent like $1 million to do design and engineering, to do a lot of different things that I would never do at a very early planning stage. In a regular planning process, that would probably cost like $100,000, just to give you a range, ballpark range. The engineers back at home are all going, oh God, she didn't say that, but I did. And the point is, we can't compare those two things and act as though one has a much greater cost discipline than the other, because they're not the same thing. All right, so if we want to spend $1 million for every project we put into the MTEP before we even have a stakeholder discussion, before MISO optimizes it, before we even know if we're going to move it forward, we can do that. But it's probably not a good use of resources. So I think we need to focus on the estimates when we get to the point where we're actually doing design and engineering to really look at whether we have cost overruns or not. And then we need to figure out what are escalators that cannot be controlled by anyone. I can't control what the price of steel is. I can try to come up with a proxy, but you know what? Things happen, tariffs change, things happen. Same thing with demand. We don't know what kind of demand there might be at any given time. We don't know what kind of political disruptions there may be. What if COVID happens? I mean, you know, there's so many things that are variables. And so I'm not excusing the idea that we need to have discipline and financial discipline, nor am I arguing against transparency with respect to estimates versus actual. But what I am saying is I think that there's a very big clamoring as though, you know, transmission is just so expensive and it's, you know, just everybody just spends whatever they want and nobody even knows what it is. And, you know, that's just not accurate. At least in the RTOs that we're in, we have, you know, reports that we have to do on actuals to estimate. Most of the regions have some kind of transparency process through the RTOs. And in addition, there's all sorts of built-in protections. Customers can come back to us in the rate protocols when they do their questions, which the commission is made very open-ended. And they can say, well, why did this project cost more than you said it was going to cost? So there are ways that this could be addressed. But I don't think anyone is opposed to the idea that we need to make sure that we're doing our best to stay on budget and stay on target, but I think we need to be realistic too. And I worry that the competitive aspects of Water 1000 have created a false sense that somehow prices are being more controlled. And I don't think costs are being more controlled. I think costs are being more hidden, because I think what's happening is we're getting low estimates with a lot of exclusions. And so by the time the project comes in and goes into service and all those exclusions are factored in, it's probably not that much cheaper, if cheaper at all, than some of the other bids. But it's an illusory thing because you can't see it up front. You only know about it later in the process. So I would caution everyone to say, you know, you wouldn't even expect someone to build your house without them having some flexibility in terms of what the ultimate project may cost, because they don't control everything. Well, in the same way, utilities don't control everything. You know, the idea of having a firm price cap just doesn't make any sense. What does make sense is profit sharing. If the idea is to change the incentives, well, let people be able to keep part of what they kill. You know, if they can bring down the price of a project, then maybe they should share that with customers. You know, there's different ways of doing this, but I do think that we need to be careful about this dialogue that transmission is all money out the door and it's not worth it, because one, we're already undervaluing the benefits, and two, we're not really looking at the fact that the reason that the price of generation has dropped dramatically in this country is because of transmission, not because they did something on their own. Yes, the price point has dropped and they have cheaper fuel costs, but none of that would matter if they couldn't get connected to the grid. So that's why transmission costs are going up, among other things. And so we need to recognize that you get the benefit on one end, but some of the cost is on the other side. So I guess that's my answer, Larry.
Great. Chairman Scripps, let me change over to you. I know this is a concern for state commissions. What are you, as a state commissioner, state chairman, looking to see come out of the ANOPR process on the issues surrounding cost containment and oversight?
Yeah, and thanks, Larry. I think this is one of the most important parts of the ANOPR, and really because at the end of the day, these are real costs paid by real people, and we, I think, have a responsibility as state regulators, as participants in the process, to make sure that these issues are being fly-specced with a great amount of detail. That doesn't mean that I don't have issues on the particulars. I think the details matter, and the details have a lot of work to be sort of fully vetted and addressed through the process. But I think the focus on cost containment is right, because at the end of the day, as Eric said, we're going to build a lot of transmission. I think we need to. But if we're going to do that, then I think we've got a responsibility first to make sure that we're maximizing the value of what we already have, and whether that's the existing wires or the existing corridors, but really to make sure that we're sort of wringing every ounce of benefit out of the system that we have today before we ask customers to pay for more. The second is really on driving down costs where we can. And I think what Nina said about the shared savings mechanisms, we've started to use those in Michigan on the distribution system, or on things like demand response and energy waste reduction, what everybody else in the world calls energy efficiency. I think there are models that maybe we haven't fully used in the transmission space, but they're out there. And I think looking at ways that we can drive down the costs of the system and of the improvements that we need. And then the third part is to optimize the portfolio. We can't look at just the cost of transmission in isolation, because there are big numbers being thrown out, and whether that's sort of what's needed across the country or just in MISO or just in Michigan. But if you look at it in a vacuum, and whatever the number is, but one of the numbers being thrown out for Future One in MISO is $30 billion on transmission alone. Well, that's a lot of money. That's a lot of money to ask customers to pay for. But if ultimately, as Nina talked about, that gets you access to cheaper generation resources, if ultimately that represents an optimized portfolio, I'll say I'd rather sign, my ratepayers up to pay a transmission cost that's part of an optimized portfolio than pay a little less for transmission and then twice as much for generation. And I think that's the sort of systems approach that we need to keep in mind as we're doing this. But ultimately, these are real costs, and I think we need to make sure that we're counting every penny as we go through this process. Because in some ways, that's the best way to build the political support for some of the pretty significant changes that we're going to see. If we've got public trust that we've maximized the value of what we have, that we've been as prudent as we can in fly specking the cost of the additions, and that the portfolio is ultimately optimized, I think we're going to get a lot farther and be able to have some enduring quality of support for the projects that ultimately need to get built.
Nina, you want an opportunity to respond?
You're muted, Nina, and I really want.
Yeah.
That's my signal for I have something else to say. I forgot to mention that, one of the things I think we also tend to do in the transmission process is we tend to look at everything as, let's build as little as possible now because that'll be cheaper. It's just like, it's like building at your home, right? If you do the 2 bathrooms at the same time, it actually saves you money because they already have the crews out there and they already are buying the equipment. And so with transmission, we can go in and build a 138 kV and meet the immediate need. But if we built the 345, then we would actually save customers money because I didn't have to build 2 totally separate projects, right? Now, some of the costs are a write-off because you've already paid for the right-of-way, for example, or at least some of it, and some other things. But I just think that we do need to start thinking, too, a little bit about, and this goes to the planning process. If you're planning right, then this is already taken care of. But if you can't get it at the planning end, then at least you should get it at the building end, which is, let's not just build the absolute minimum we need to build, because at some point we're going to need more of this. And I'm not talking about gold plating the system and we have so much capacity, we can't ever possibly use it. I'm talking about, well, we can build enough so that we get through the next 5 to 6 years, or we can build enough so that we get through 20 years. I mean, there might be some benefit, and I haven't studied this, so I don't know, maybe that's something wires can do, Larry. But I think that one of the things we really need to think about is efficiencies of scale, and making sure that when we talk about costs, we don't talk about it as a point in time. We talk about it as an overall product that will be in use for over 40 years. Now I know that there's this issue that FERC always has. I'm looking at Eric with which customer is it? Is it the customer for today or the customer 20 years from now? And I do understand that that's a concern. But I also think when you're talking about, when we build roads, we don't go, well, we need to widen the road, so we're only going to widen it a ½ inch. We definitely tend to, when you go in there to do it, you want to be just do it once and then be done with it. And so I do think we need to think through a little bit whether we're building too small and too slowly.
Well, great, thanks. We are starting to get a couple of questions coming in, I see. Before I turn to what I've got here, I just have one more question I want to follow up with you, Eric, on something that Nina touched on in her earlier comment. In the ANOPR, there's a bit of a suggestion looking at either, I'm not sure they phrased it actually as competition or rights of first refusal, but there was a little bit of an indication, I think, in the ANOPR, but not much. I guess I'm curious about that Is the commission open to or looking to take on issues surrounding competition and rights of first refusal, or is that something they put in there but they don't really want to touch? Just curious as to what sense you have on that topic.
Larry, I think on that one, I think the ANOPR speaks for itself. I unfortunately don't have much to add. I think, unfortunately, the issue of competition has been probably one of the thorniest issues that have come out of Order 1000. And in a way, that's a little bit unfortunate because the issue of competition is really at the end of what is already a very long journey through the transmission planning process. And so, I think the NOPR really focuses on, kind of what is the bulk of the process, but it does kind of acknowledge that tail end issue of competition there at the end. It's obviously an issue that engenders a lot of different opinions, as Chairman Chatterjee used to say. Everybody agrees that Order 1000 is broken, just nobody can agree how to fix it. So I think that's an issue where folks should take a look at the ANOPR, obviously provide comments, but in terms of next steps, you'd have to ask one of the 4 or 5 folks that actually gets a vote.
Well, fair enough. I thought I'd ask anyway. But oh, Nina, is that your signal? You have something to say? Okay, go ahead. It's very subtle.
It wasn't subtle, but I have no choice. I'm on an iPad. It's just like strung up by like stuff I've piled up. It's a big mess over here. Anyway, the one thing I wanted to say about competition is this. I think we need to be realistic and understand that once you add together all of the states that are not in regional transmission organizations, which is a decent part of the country, who are not competitive, not having competitive processes, and then you add in the states that have already instituted ROFR, or ROFR protections at the state level. And then you add in the states who are basically avoiding Order 1000 competition by having their own RFPs and their own internal processes to select competitors. We're not left with a whole bunch of people who are really participating in this process. And even within regions, we have some states and transmission developers who are subject to competition and some who aren't. And so what we have is a very limited process with, I would argue, not a lot of documentable benefits. We have a lot of ideas of what the benefit of competition is, and we have a lot of thoughts, but at the end of the day, we have cost of service. Our rates are still regulated by FERC. You win a bid, it doesn't mean anything. You still have to go to FERC and do a DCF and have your rates regulated. And you win a bid, that's fine, but you still got to get it cited and you got to get the land. It doesn't change anything. It's not like you're something. It seems to me that what we wanted to solve was a problem that there was an impression that incumbents were not building and that we needed to make sure that they built. And I know that other people wanted innovation and other people, there were all kinds of reasons, but at the end of the day, that was a big part of it. But we created a very expensive, very lengthy process that doesn't apply to very many people anymore. And I think that we need to make sure that that's not a roadblock to getting the transmission we need built. Because as I said, if you look at what really drives up the price of transmission, it doesn't matter who's building it. There's been some arguments that there are some entities who are leveraging public power partners to get cheaper costs of financial costs, loans and whatnot, financing. And I guess my question would be, well, do we just want the whole country to be part of public power and then the taxpayers can pay that for everybody? So I think that we need to recognize that at the end of the day, what we're allowed to earn hasn't changed. And so while competition is supposed to be having great benefits for customers, I don't really see that at this point. I see a couple projects being awarded to people who are incumbents elsewhere, sometimes not subject to competition within their own footprint, who may or may not end up coming in below what their cost estimate was because they have escalators and it'll probably go up at the end of the day. So I had to get that in because I know that it's a touchy subject. People don't want to talk about it, but I want to make sure that we understand that I don't think competition is the solution to the problems that we have right now on the system. We have a lot of problems, but competition isn't really solving very many of them.
Well, Chairman Scripps, I don't want to deny you the opportunity to weigh in if you would like to, but don't feel like you are obligated if you'd rather not.
No, I guess the only thing I'd say is I think there's probably broad agreement that competition works. There's broad agreement that it hasn't worked as well as anticipated in the Order 1000 context. And from my vantage point, my biggest frustration is that the efforts to avoid competition and the efforts on sort of what projects ultimately need to be bid out is driving the planning process, and that's the tail wagging the dog. And so we have to find a way, I think, to be more honest in the planning process and then let the chips fall where they may at the end. But right now we've got a process where either cost allocation and or efforts to avoid having to competitively bid projects is interfering in the planning process, and that is a recipe for ensuring that you don't have an optimal plan.
Well, great, thank you. Let me turn to one of the questions I have here, which is says it's a question for Eric and or other panelists. So Eric, we'll start with you and then open it up to Chairman Scripps and Nina if they care to weigh in. But question is this: how do you see energy storage and or non-transmission alternatives fitting into the ANOPR?
Great question. So I do believe there was at least one, maybe more than one question with regard to non-transmission alternatives in the ANOPR. I think we are continuing to see a lot of interest in what some people call non-transmission alternatives, or some people would call grid enhancing technologies. That's an area where we're seeing continued interest, and I think comments on how to whether and how to consider those in the planning process would certainly be welcome. I'll also point folks to our technical conference we're having on September 10th about grid enhancing technologies, and we're also considering some shared savings like mechanisms similar to what Chairman Scripps was referring to a minute ago. So that's another opportunity in addition to the ANOPR process. If folks have thoughts they want to share on ways we can better enhance better enhance the use of grid enhancing technologies through both rate design and then also the transmission planning process.
Thanks. Nina or Chairman Scripps, do either of you have any comments on that point?
Just two really quick ones. First of all, I think it's consistent. I mean, this is really what I'm talking about in terms of maximizing the value of what we already have and also looking at alternatives. So it's really, I think, that prudence review in sort of kicking the tires on projects, knowing that a lot of projects are going to go forward, but there may be places where energy storage resources or other non-transmission alternative grid enhancing technologies can sort of do the same or more for less, and we should be open to that. The other piece that I guess I would say in this is just I think we need to make sure as we're looking at this that two things. One is that there's a level playing field between the developers. If this is, I think, ultimately often sort of shows up in the interconnection issues where a transmission owner may be able to move forward a project that an independent storage developer may not be able to, because it takes 3 years to get through the queue process, and how do you get that into an MTEP cycle in MISO, for example. So continued efforts, I think, on that front are important. And then the other piece is really sort of to Nina's earlier point, is this the sort of least cost optimal option to get the least that we need for now, or is this able to do as much as an actual wires steel in the ground project? I don't want to say, okay, well, this specific project you might be able to address with this, but but you'll never be able to, if it goes from a 138 to a 345, you'd never be able to do that with the NTA or with the ESR. And that's the issue where I think we just need to keep reminding ourselves what we're actually trying to get here.
Go ahead, Nina.
Okay, I'll be brief. I would just say this. I think long-term storage has to be part of the renewable penetration scheme. Once we get to the cliff, it's too much renewables and you can't do the geographic balancing, and you need that storage probably to help with that. Most of the storage we're seeing today is at the distribution level, right? And so I think that we need to recognize that I think storage has got great opportunities, but the way that it's dealt with at FERC right now is you can have it as a transmission piece. Instead of building a line, you can have the storage. And the opportunities for that are pretty small. There aren't a lot of what I'll call true transmission functions for storage. Or you can have it in the market and you can do peak shaving, but you can't do both. And the value proposition of storage is you can do both. And so I think that that's a challenge. And I know from a regulatory point of view, I don't know how you fix it. But from a market's point of view, from an efficiency point of view, it's illogical. And it's part of the reason that a lot of people aren't building it. Because from a transmission point of view, I can't find that many examples where I could really, I think there's only been like one or two that have actually been built on the transmission grid just as a transmission facility. I'm glad that FERC allowed that opportunity, but the reality is you need the market piece to make it economic for you as the owner and the developer. And then I guess I would just say that I do think that on other NTAs, you know, Wires did a study a couple of years back on this, and it is important to remember that they are not in every instance substitutes for each other. They don't carry the same ancillary services, they don't meet the same benefits. And so I think Chairman Scripps has already talked about this a little bit, but you know, at the end of the day, sometimes an NTA can get you a year or two, you know, it buys you some time before you have to do something on the transmission side. But then we get into this conversation, which is, well, if we didn't fix the need permanently and we're just going to have to build a line in 3 years, are we doing anything? Is that really helping anything? Maybe it is. Maybe because it's time for a line to get built. Maybe it does some important things. But in and of itself, I think we need to be realistic. Obviously, you know, efficiencies, demand response, those things are probably the most, have the highest potential for real benefit, just by decreasing load and managing load. But at the end of the day, you know, I think that we need to be realistic too. You know, we're going to have some DR, DG, we're going to have these different things. They're going to have a role. I'm not saying they aren't, but are they going to supplant needing wires in the air? Probably not.
Great, thanks. I'll characterize the next submission that I got, because it's not really in the form of a question, but it just says that, Nina, you made some great points earlier today, but I think you're questioning your comments about the value of cost containment provisions agreed to by competitive developers. So I think we have the making of maybe our next webinar, which will be a nice crossfire type presentation on that issue, Jeff. So file that one away for next time. Anyway, it's not really a question. It was more of a comment. It looks like we're pretty close to the end of our time period. What I was going to just ask, and Eric, I'm going to let you off the hook on this one. I'm going to really turn it over to Nina and Chairman Scripps. Just very quickly, if you could just give me a pretty quick summary of what are your 2 or maybe 3 things you'd like to see come out of this ANOPR process at the very end. What do you think are the top priorities for FERC to be focusing on? And Nina, I'll start with you, and then Chairman Scripps, I'll let you do back cleanup on this one.
Okay. I guess first and foremost, you know, SPP and MISO have very large generation queues. We can have a debate about how much of that is phantom generation or duplicate generation. Doesn't matter. There's so much in there that we have to get it connected. So one of the big things we really need to see the ANOPR do is make some changes to the planning process that are going to alleviate the pressure on the queue. Because the problem isn't just, although it's partly the problem is that we just have a lot more generators wanting to interconnect. And we had a lot of people get in the queue because of the tax policies and trying to make sure they meet certain dates. All those things are true, but the reality is the market wants more renewables and we need to connect them. And that's part of a mandate under Order, you know, 890, going all the way back to open access. I mean, we can't deny people service by making it take 20 years to get connected. So we need a planning process that in some way fixes that. It could be some queue reform, it could be clustering, mega clustering, it could be vintaging. I mean, I don't know, there's different things you could do, but at the end of the day, I think we really need to see some movement there. And I don't think just putting in like a new financial milestone or making in ministerial changes, which we've seen done before, we've kind of got all the blood out of that stone we can get. So I hope ANOPR will fix that. I hope that the ANOPR will allow us to recognize more fully the benefits of transmission and also have a more forward-looking, sort of multifaceted approach to planning. And then finally, I guess I would say that I do hope that we do see some recognition of, you know, what we need to do in terms of making sure that developers are able to do their job too. making sure that we're able to have an environmental regulatory certainty that we need and the other things that we need so that people will want to continue to invest in the sector. I know it's been a very popular, we've had a big uptick. We had decades of nothing, and then all of a sudden we had a big uptick, and everybody's in the transmission sector, and now everyone's putting their money into generation and distribution. And so I think we're going to see that coming down unless we do something to stimulate it. And the last thing I would just say is that I would really encourage people not to look at regional transmission as it's either regional transmission or it's local transmission. I mean, they're both needed. You can eliminate the need for some of the local projects when you do a bigger build, but a lot of times underbuild is still needed, or local reliability criteria is still there. So I think we need to get away from this paradigm. It's like we're either going to just build all these huge projects or we're going to end up just building reliability. It's really not that clear. It's going to be a combination of the two.
So I'll do two just to close out. I don't disagree with anything that Nina said. The first is, and this isn't going to surprise anybody, but that there is a role for states that's maintained. I still think that the cooperative federalism that's at the heart of the Federal Power Act is an enduring and an appropriate way of thinking about sort of the multi-jurisdictional elements within the grid. And sort of maintaining a role for the states, I think is really important for all the ways that states sort of ultimately are closer to the folks paying the bills and communities being impacted by siting decisions and everything else. So that's one, and that's not a surprise that a state regulator would say. I don't think it needs to look exactly the same, and I think there's room for conversation, but the states still have a role to play in this discussion, and I'm glad that the task force is being set up on a parallel track where that's really baked in from the start. And then the second is really, this has to result in a path forward. We have to get projects built, and we have to have a sense of urgency that's commensurate with the fact that the future is in many ways already here. We are seeing the downsides of not having a transmission infrastructure and a grid that's sort of ready for the challenges that are here and only likely to grow. And so, we can talk about the theoretical stuff. We can look at the sort of every last nickel. At the end of the day, we've got to build. And if this ultimately results in a process that allows for that, then I think it'll be a success.
Great. Eric, any last words from the FERC perspective? If not, we'll close it out.
No, just thank you again. Appreciate the opportunity to be here, and thanks for a great discussion.
I want to thank all of the panelists for their participation. This was a great discussion as far as I was concerned. We covered a lot. There is a heck of a lot more to talk about besides what we just discussed. But I want to thank Midwest Governors Association for working with us on this. And Jeff, I'll turn it back over to you.
No, thank you very much, Larry. And again, big thank you to the panelists here today for providing their thoughts. And appreciate everyone tuning in for this webinar. Nothing else here on my end, so take care and have a good rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.